Welcome to the Pediatrics specialty video brought to you by the Alpha Omega Alpha chapter at the University of Washington School of Medicine. I am Mackenzie Rinaldi. I'm a current fourth-year medical student at the University of Washington School of Medicine, graduating this June 2020, and I applied pediatrics. So this PowerPoint is going to go over all of the things here on the right side in regards to applying to pediatrics for residency and what that career looks like in different career opportunities. So that includes the scope of practice of peds, why I chose this field, the specifics of residency and the career, electives to consider during medical school, the timeline of things to work on throughout these 4 years in thinking about applying to residency in peds, letters of recommendation, who you should get them from and how to do that, how to make yourself a competitive applicant, helpful resources to look at throughout the next 4 years, and fellowship opportunities after residency. Scope of practice of pediatrics. So what can pediatricians do? And the short answer is anything. The opportunities after residency are somewhat of a changing landscape. In the last few years, the subspecialty of pediatric hospitalist medicine has been recognized, and it is now a fellowship. As time goes on, more and more hospitals will require pediatric hospitalists to be board certified. So if that is something that you think you want to do, I would be considering that fellowship to keep all of those doors open. So after residency, you are most definitely qualified for any outpatient position. And that really can look like a lot of different things, from full-time to part-time positions. Some clinics do evenings and weekends. Some have a little bit of a urgent care role. Some include more developmental pediatrics or adolescent medicine. You really can kind of create your own adventure in terms of whatever you're looking for in outpatient peds. And then there are many, many fellowships, which we will get to towards the end of the slideshow. But it includes anything in the spectrum from inpatient medicine to subspecialty inpatient and outpatient medicine to acute and intensive care, also including emergency medicine. And the other thing to think about if you're interested in working with kids is there's lots of combined degrees. And I'll probably forget some, but these include things like child psych, which is really triple board, that includes child psych, adult psych, and pediatrics are the three that you would be board certified in. There's pediatric emergency medicine, which you can do straight through instead of doing a fellowship after peds. There is child neurology, which is a combined program. Pediatric anesthesiology is a combined program. There's also med peds, which is internal medicine and pediatrics. So if you're thinking about working with kids, but you also want to work with adults, those would be other specialties to consider. So why I chose pediatrics is a complicated answer that I've distilled down to these 6 ideas. And something that I would really encourage everyone to think about, regardless of what specialty you think you want to go into, is consider which characteristics are important to you to have in this career and think about what specialties you can apply them to. So one for me is prevention. I remember being so frustrated on one of my first rotations in internal medicine when dealing with these complex problems that had been going on for decades that really felt like could have been prevented with a conversation 50 years ago. So that is really how I learned that prevention would be an important part of my career and thinking about promoting and developing lifelong health for these kids. And tied to that is an advocacy component that really looks like a lot of different things in peds. You're advocating for the kid with their parents. You're advocating for the family with their school and their community and the parents' employment. And then there's community-based advocacy and policy level, working on safe car seats and vaccinations and access. There's lots that can be done in regards to advocacy. And diversity here means diversity in patients in terms of ages and ethnic backgrounds, and the diversity in career as well, and that there's inpatient and outpatient and subspecialty, and I'm not ready to commit to any one of those things just yet. And so in doing this path, I really have all my doors still open. And I'm also interested in the unique pathology in pediatrics, the certain infectious diseases that only happen in kids, the vaccination conversations that really only happen with kids, and some of the social stuff, which ties back into prevention and setting up these goals and parameters for lifelong health, and relationships, working with these parents to promote kind of all the things that I just said, and building trust so that you can get them to believe that what you're doing is really trying to help their kid. And then joy. I don't think there's any other field of medicine that really forces you to smile every single day and be a goofball at heart, and kids are just awesome. So for the specifics, pediatric residency is 3 years. The salary varies quite significantly depending on outpatient, generalist versus subspecialist, and also if you are more rural or more in a city. Generally, there's a need-based component, so the more rural you are and the greater the need is, you will have a higher salary. Just for instance, when I've been poking around at jobs, things in Moscow, Idaho make twice as much as a job in Seattle, Washington. So that is something to consider. And the average week also varies quite significantly depending on what you're doing. Outpatient can be anything from a 9 to 5 type job to 410s to doing some evenings and weekends. Hospitalist work is more like shift work. Some of that includes 24s or doing nocturnal work, and same with more intensivist jobs doing Q3, Q4, 24 or 30-hour shifts. So here is a map of the pediatric residency programs in the United States. There's also one in Hawaii, and there is an Alaska track available through Seattle Children's Hospital, so those two are not depicted. But as you can see, those of us living in the upper left USA have more limited options in terms of geographic relevance. So just know that if you're applying pediatrics, you may be applying a little more broadly than some other specialties. So when you're planning your 3rd and 4th year schedules, there's not a lot of things that you have to get done in order to apply to peds. The most important is doing a pediatric sub-I. And if you're at UW, I would recommend doing that at Seattle Children's, particularly if you have not spent any time there and did not do your 3rd year rotation there. It's a great opportunity to get a letter of recommendation from a major pediatric residency program. I think that really helps in terms of making yourself a competitive applicant if you have a good grade and a strong letter of recommendation from a top 10 residency program as part of your residency application. Certainly speaks volumes. In terms of doing away rotations, pediatrics is not a field that requires that unless you have a geographic reason that you need to go to a certain program. Then I would do an away there to really show your interest if it's not your home program. But otherwise, do what you want to do. If there's somewhere you want to go explore for a month and you want to do an away there, then awesome. Otherwise, you don't have to do any. I did 0, and it did not hinder my application process. And the last thing I would say is to be curious. This is your last time to really expose yourself to things that are not going to be included in pediatric residency. So if you have any other interests outside of pure peds, now would be the time to do it. Like I did a rotation at Planned Parenthood. That was awesome. And I got to practice putting in IUDs and Nexplanons. And that actually made me realize that that's something that I would like to do as part of my pediatric practice. So it was questions that I learned that I should ask as I was interviewing at programs to learn what opportunities there were for contraceptive care in the pediatric population in these different programs. So that is something that I would encourage you to think about. Other things would be specialties that overlap with peds that are not necessarily in residency. Things like ENT and optho and derm, child abuse, and child psych are not always dedicated rotations. They are in some programs, but not all. So other things to think about. Otherwise, just have fun, especially fourth year. It's your last chance to just explore medicine without having so much of a set schedule. So here's a general timeline for thinking about applying to pediatrics across all 4 years of medical school. And most of you watching this are probably a few steps into it, but we'll start at the beginning anyways. So as a first year, really just study. That's the best thing you can do no matter what specialty you're applying in. You will thank yourself later because it will make studying for step 1 and step 2 easier the more that you've learned the first time. And as crazy as this sounds, first year is really the most time you will have to explore things outside of the classroom. So that's where I've highlighted passion projects. If there's anything that interests you, find the time to do it in first and second year, because third and fourth year you really are moving around all the time and you have clinic time restraints that just do not always allow for that. So volunteering and doing maybe extra research, which is not required for pediatrics, but anything that excites you, that's really the time to do it. And the big thing for second year of medical school is step 1, which is also changing to pass-fail, so we'll see how relevant that stays. But the average step score for pediatrics is at 227, which is right around the average score for the University of Washington. And really, there's a fairly wide bell curve over that. So if you get under 227, pediatrics door is not necessarily closed for you. It would just be more important to do well in your clinical rotations and really push yourself to do better on step 2, which brings us to the third year of medical school. Doing well on your Gen Peds rotation is important. You don't have to get honors to apply to this specialty, but the more competitive you can make your objective data, the better. And this is really where you can request a letter of rec as well. And the average step 2 score for pediatrics is 243. Again, it has a bell curve over it, so getting a standard deviation below is not the end of the world. There are plenty of people who get into residency every year with lower data. It's just important to maximize whatever you can. So if test taking is difficult for you and you know that about yourself, try as hard as you can, and then also push yourself to do well in the clinical rotations and get strong letters of recommendation. Which brings us to your fourth year of medical school, which is your pediatric sub-I, and that you should do well on. Like I said a couple slides back, doing that at Seattle Children's is something that I would recommend, and again, getting a letter of rec from that rotation. The details about applying to residency for peds is everything is shifted a little more forward than some other specialties. So applications on ARIS are due the middle of September, and interview invitations really start a couple days after that. And they can come fast, and you can get a lot of them in September, and then some programs kind of trickle out into October. Interviews themselves start in the very end of September. There's not a lot of programs that do that though, so I wouldn't schedule like you're going to have interviews in September. And then there's some in October, lots in November and December, and then they'll go into the middle of January. So if you have the flexibility to take time off, I would recommend for sure taking November and December to give yourself the most flexibility to schedule pediatric interviews. If you can also take a little time into October or January, I would do that. You don't have to take both October and January. I would pick one and either try and front load, or if you're picking October, or pick January and push your interviews back a little bit. So letters of recommendation. Most programs require 3, some will accept 4. And some of them have very strict parameters of what they want their letters of rec to be, and that's really what this reflects. Some are more casual than that. So almost all want at least one letter from a pediatrics attending that you've worked with, and that can come from third year or fourth year or a volunteer project, somebody who you've had significant contact with. And then a couple programs are more specific in that they also want a letter from your pediatric clerkship director. So that is something that I would just plan for because it's easier to get it while you're there, particularly if you're not working with that attending. If you can set up a time to meet with them to talk about your interest in pediatrics while you're on your clerkship, that makes it easier for them the next year when you're applying. But it's not required. And if you realize that late in third year that you want to do peds and that clerkship has come and gone, it's not a closed door to get that letter whatsoever. You just call them up and say, now I'm doing this, can we come talk? And peds people are extraordinarily nice, so they will bend over backwards to make that happen for you. And most programs do not have a requirement for the third letter, so just pick someone who knows you well, can speak to your strengths, and it helps when you're thinking about your letter writers if they have experience writing letters of recommendation or working with residency programs and have a good idea of what programs are looking for in a letter and can write you a good one. You may have an awesome relationship with someone, but if they're not a very good writer or don't really understand the task, that letter is not going to be as helpful for you. So how to make yourself a competitive applicant for pediatrics. And in all honesty, there's no magical formula. I wish there were. But peds is a less competitive specialty. So there's very few things that you really have to get done in order to be a competitive applicant. So these are some of my ideas just to how to set yourself up for success. And the first one of those is to maximize your objective data. And that means step 1, step 2, and your clerkship grades. And there's a little bit of a joke including clerkship grades with that, because some of us would argue that they're not as objective as we would like them to be. They don't always make sense, but just do the best that you can in all 3 of those arenas, and then maximize the other areas as well. And those include mentorship and getting plugged in with the pediatric career advisors early. It's a great opportunity to answer some of your questions and get plugged in with an attending in the field, in addition to joining the pediatric interest group. And through that, you can get some peer mentorship and mentorship from students a year or 2 above, and get involved with activities relating to kids. And that really can help with number 3 of demonstrating a clear interest in pediatrics. Even if you just have 1 or 2 things on your application that are working with kids outside of the required clinical setting of 3rd and 4th year, it really is much more appealing to interview and accept someone who has demonstrated an interest versus someone where it looks like this is a fallback option. And I do want to be clear that if this is a late decision for you to choose pediatrics, that is okay. Just try to find something that you can add to your application that shows that you want to work with kids outside of that required clerkship. Here are some resources to look at throughout medical school. For the 3rd year clerkship, the clip cases are really what's most important, particularly for the test at the end, and also the pediatric survival guide that they'll give you at the beginning of the clerkship. What's most helpful in that I would carry around all the time is the vital signs that are so different by age, and that's not something that you really have ever learned before this clerkship and memorized. So that is super helpful to help you recognize what's normal and not normal. And then some other things that I would just keep an eye on here and there would be the American Academy of Pediatrics. They have a student membership, which is $25 a year, and you have access to all of their website, which includes publications and emails, but also other opportunities to get involved. You can be a representative from UW and get to attend the national conference. They also have like a national pediatric interest group and a section for pediatric trainees. So more opportunities to be involved and also have mentorship. And then these 2 links are more important when you're actually applying. The match data goes through the most recent data for all of the specialties regarding match, including step scores, the number of research publications, the number of volunteer experiences, etc., for people who match and don't match. And then FREIDA is the database of all the residency programs. And you can sort through by geographic region, certain parameters like step score, how big it is, and those kinds of things. It's really the backbone of helping you choose where to apply. There are many, many fellowship opportunities after a pediatric residency. I'm not going to read these all off to you, but know that if you can think it, you can pretty much create it in pediatrics. Most of these are 3 years. There are a couple that are 2 and maybe 1 or 2 that's 4 years post-residency. But realize that there are tons of flexibility and different options when it comes to careers in pediatrics. All right, well, we made it through. Thank you so much for listening to this whole PowerPoint. That's me, Mackenzie, and I'm happy to be a resource to you. That's my personal email. If you have any questions, really at any time, about applying pediatrics or thinking about it, questions about the field, I am more than happy to answer them. So best of luck.